am. I'm making a new plan, rearranging my life, and I won't look back ever again.
In Canada, much like in the US, Indigenous women and girls are disproportionately affected by violence. Although Indigenous women make up 7% of Canada's female population, they make up 28% of all women murdered in Canada. There is no way to actually quantify the actual number of women and girls lost because so many go unreported, uninvestigated, and unprosecuted. But the number is to believe to be in the thousands. And the story I'm bringing you today is the death of Joey English, and is just one example of how this systemic racism has played out in far too many cases here in Canada. Joey was from the Piikani Nation, which is on reserved land just north of the Montana border. But her and her mom Stephanie had recently moved to Calgary, which is just under 2 hours drive away from the Piikani Nation. Calgary is one of Canada's larger cities with all of the trappings of most major cities: drugs, crimes, etc. And the city is separated into neighborhoods, some considered good and some considered less desirable. But one of my favorite things about our city here is that we have incorporated green spaces and wooded areas into our city so that you can easily escape the concrete jungle and dip into one of our parks and feel transported into a forest of evergreens and poplar trees with trails for walking and biking. By the age of 25, Joey had 3 children, and all of them, along with her sister, Allison's 2 young children, and Joey's 2 younger teenage brothers, were living with her mom, Stephanie. Large, extended families all living under one roof is pretty standard in Indigenous communities. It does take a village after all, and Stephanie thrived having babies and family around her. Joey had a close relationship with her family, particularly her mom and her sister Allison, who was 3 years younger than her. Joey's Aunt Barb said of Joey, she was crazy, upbeat, always laughed, and liked to joke around. The resemblance of Joey to her mother is remarkable, both attractive beauties with olive skin and a fierceness about them that is undeniable. Her mom Stephanie says of her, she was always loving and laughing. Joey was a really gentle girl, really caring. She was really compassionate to complete strangers. If they were hungry, she would feed them, or if they were cold, she would give her jacket to them. The English family had suffered a loss of one of Stephanie's brothers around 2010 when Allison and Joey were just teenagers. Allison, in particular, took the death of her uncle particularly hard. I wasn't able to dig up any information on their uncle or how he had died, but all reports just used the terminology he was killed. So it was obviously an untimely death and not of natural causes or disease. The grief had driven Allison to be taken into a psychiatric ward for a time due to severe depression. She managed to escape on June 1st, 2015, and was found 9 days later deceased along with her boyfriend on the Sunchild First Nation, which is a Cree community. The RCMP ruled their deaths both as suicides, which Stephanie and Joey thought was likely an accidental overdose, but was suspicious enough to be like a murder suicide, but it wasn't really looked into. Allison was only 20 at the time and the mother of 2 small children, and at the time of her sister's death, Joey was pregnant with her third child. She was 24. Reeling from the loss of her sister and her uncle, Joey was put on antidepressants and started to slide into recreational drugs. But her third baby was born healthy and at full term around January 2016, and that's also around the time that Joey started to spend quite a bit of time in the company of a 40-year-old man and locally known drug dealer, Joshua Jordan Weise. There are no reports stating if this was a romantic relationship or a platonic one, but she did spend quite a bit of time in the basement apartment of his house in Highland Park. As Stephanie and Joey were very close and her young children were in the care a lot of time with Stephanie, they kept in close contact with each other despite Joey's issues with substance abuse. So in early June 2016, when Joey suddenly stopped contact with her, Stephanie immediately had the gut feeling that something was very off about that. So she called the Calgary police to report Joey missing, and when the officer took the call, he asked the usual questions. When did you last hear from her? Why do you feel she's missing? The usual blah, blah, blah. And then when they get to the questions of physical description, which always include what's her nationality, when Stephanie indicated that she was Indigenous, the officer said, "We'll call you back." But no one did call her back. So she called again and was given a similar response. By the 9th of June, Stephanie had made 4 calls to the Calgary police about Joey being missing. She had never received a call back or any update on if her disappearance was even being looked into. I have been researching cases for well over a year now, and I have encountered many cases where even children as young as 12, when reported missing to the RCMP or police by Indigenous families, the response is typically, "She's probably on a bender, she'll turn up when she sobers up." So, this non response from the police and racist assumptions is unfortunately somewhat typical. Meanwhile, over in Crescent Heights, which is an upscale area peppered with high priced townhouses that is situated on the top of a hill overlooking the city's downtown, on the edge of Crescent Road that winds along the area is a steep embankment known as McHugh Bluff, which is a grassy and wooded area with trails for biking and walking that leads down into the downtown and to the Elbow River, which runs through our city. Along that Crescent Road, there are magnificent views of the river and the lights of downtown beyond it, which is why it is a more upscale area. So, if you live in Crescent Heights, you can use these lovely nature trails and still be at work downtown in about a 20-minute walk, which is what one man was doing on the morning of June 7th, which was a Tuesday. And on his walk down the hill, he noticed a rather unpleasant odor, which he assumed was someone throwing garbage in the park. 2 days later, on June 9th, he took the same route and noticed the same foul odor and decided to investigate a little bit further. And there, in what is described as a lightly forested area, he made the grisly discovery of a woman's body, or at least part of a woman's body. When a body is found, as is normal protocol, the Calgary police hold a press conference for the media as an initial part of any major investigation. Because information released to the public is fairly controlled here, it's common for police to use these press conferences to let the media know any information that they can, and usually as a way of asking for information from the public. Now, this particular press conference, compared to one that comes after it, is really of interest to me, so I paid very close attention to what was said. The key pieces of this press release given by Inspector Don Coleman are the following points. A woman's body between the ages of 18 and 40 was found. The body is not intact, and the dismemberment is not believed to be from the activity of animals in the area, and it appeared that an attempt had been made to conceal the body. They have not been able to identify her. The autopsy had been completed, but they didn't have a cause of death at that time. But based on the dismemberment, her death was considered suspicious. Making it difficult to identify her and determine a cause of death was the level of decomposition. They were also unable to tell her nationality. There was a wound on her left cheek covered by a bandage, which Inspector Don Coleman described as not so much a scar, but looks like on the left cheek something has been cut or removed, or some type of distinguishable mark that had a bandage over it, which we would surmise was pre event. When asked if there was any clothing on her or around the body to help identify her, the answer was no, suggesting she was likely found nude. So, I don't know about you, but it appears very much like her death was both untimely but also violent. Also noted in the press conference was that Calgary police do not encounter a lot of body dismemberment cases as they are a particularly egregious type of crime. During Stephanie's fifth call to the Calgary police, 2 days after the discovery of the body, the officer gave pause and wondered if perhaps this desperate mother might be referring to the Jane Doe that had been found a couple of days before. And sure enough, Stephanie identified their Jane Doe as her baby girl Joey. Desperate for answers, a tip provided by Stephanie led investigators to Joshua Weise's house in Highland Park, which was only a short drive from the Crescent Heights location. Joshua, when questioned, gave the usual bullshit story that he had gone out for a bit and when he returned home, Joey had overdosed. So he had panicked, as you probably would, and hid the body under his bed for a day or two before deciding to cut off her arms and legs with a hatchet and a knife in his bathtub, shoved her remains into a suitcase and a couple of black garbage bags, and dumped her in the wooded area next to where mothers push their toddlers in strollers and dogs fetch sticks on Sunday walks with their masters. The bags with her arms and her legs, they were likely in the landfill by now. Oh, and he admitted that he was super high at the time that he did all of this. In an effort to save you all the aggravation of doing it yourself, I did a bit of research on other cases of someone covering up an accidental death by dismembering the body. And what I found out was that, well, there isn't any. There has been research actually done on dismemberment, believe it or not. A rather large study was done in Germany and used data gathered from cases in Germany, Sweden, Poland, and Japan, which are countries with the most cases of dismemberment for some strange reason. This study was published in the National Journal of Medicine and was completed in 2016 after studying 51 cases. And just reading from the study here, analysis of all presented cases and other publications concentrating on the problem of dismemberment gave us the possibility to perform some conclusions. Apart from rare cases of necrophilia, the victim of dismemberment is always a victim of homicide. Homicides ending with corpse dismemberment are most commonly committed by a person close to or at least acquainted with the victim, and they are performed at the site of the homicide, generally in the place inhabited by the victim, the perpetrator, or shared by both. Such instances are generally not planned by the perpetrator. Again, I don't know about you, but I would agree with that study's findings. After all, I would think it would take a certain level of intestinal fortitude and emotional detachment to dismember a human being. But herein lies the very frustrating part. The police bought it, or at least they appeared to, because there are really no details of any kind of investigation after this. Now, it could be that they didn't believe his story and were trying to gather evidence. But if you remember the case of Ivy Wick here in Calgary, where they came out basically accusing the parents, like both parents, as being uncooperative, and it was definitely considered a homicide, and they were not going to stop until they got the evidence to support that. The medical examiner agreed that there were toxic levels of drugs in her system. Now, toxic for you or I, but maybe not for a seasoned drug user. And instead of doing what police normally do when they don't have enough evidence to convict, which is to say, we are unable to discount the person of interest's account of events and are not able to press charges at this time, instead they went to the media and said, there is no evidence of criminality or foul play in her death. And with that, the media kind of lost interest. Now, to be fair, she likely did have toxic levels of drugs in her system, but they closed the case as an accidental death, and the only justice the family even had a hope of getting was charges to Joshua for criminal dismemberment, which is a maximum of 5 years. And the actual charge sounds completely ridiculous for what is involved in committing the crime. Here we call it offering an indignity to human remains, which makes it sound like it's something rather kind that he has done. Like, let me offer you a once in a lifetime chance for to be dismembered and tossed away like trash. Now, I will give you that a dismembered body with high levels of drugs in the system can make determining the exact cause of death difficult, and that could be why they didn't have enough to arrest on murder charges, or maybe the evidence in the apartment was all blood and DNA that was post-mortem. But normally, they don't close a case so fast. Anyways, making matters even worse, according to Stephanie, she told Martha Troyan of the CBC in November of 2016 that the case was officially closed, but that she had gotten zero information from the police on her daughter's case and had to learn everything from the media. So she didn't know that the case was not being treated as a homicide. She learned that from the local news. And in October, when the medical examiner's office phoned her and told her that her body was ready to be released to her, she had no idea that her arms and legs were still missing and that the police had called off the search for them. Stephanie said to Martha at the time, I'm actually feeling like garbage. That's exactly how they're treating this whole case. I feel I am nothing and that I am not that important. I gave birth to a whole, complete daughter. Why do I have to bury her not complete? And in that same article, Martha quoted from an email statement received by a spokesman from the Calgary Police Service that said a full forensic examination of the crime scene was conducted, including a search of the area where it is believed Joey's remains were hidden, multiple interviews with the suspect and witnesses, and a search of the landfill. Currently, there is no evidence just showed Joey died as a result of a homicide. The service is now waiting for a report from the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner as to her cause of death, and the investigation cannot move forward as a homicide investigation unless new evidence comes forward. Now, I personally know a few homicide detectives and found them to be compassionate and amazing humans who really care about the victims' cases that they investigate and are involved in a lot of care about marginalized communities. So I'm struggling to reconcile in my brain how this could have gone down like this based on the people that I know and have met and shared space with. So it does likely come down to there just wasn't enough evidence to convict on murder. Decomposition, a good cleanup, and nothing to discount Joshua's story. So criminal dismemberment is the best that they can do. But I know plenty of other cases where they suspect homicide but can't get the evidence. And in those situations, the case remains open and they keep trying to investigate it, including planting undercover officers in jail cells. But to just close the case doesn't make sense. And if there is more to the story that I'm not aware of, like other information that clearly points away from homicide, then release those details because this is making the entire department look bad and, quite frankly, a bit racist. Instead, they sent Inspector Don Coleman out to do a second press conference, and he gave a rather rambling account of how there was no criminal acts involved in her death, but they're still investigating. He said they weren't releasing a lot of details out of respect for the family, and then said that she was reported missing 2 days after her body was found, which we know is not factually correct, as she was reported missing long before that. But no one took Stephanie seriously until they found a body. And from my opinion, he appeared disinterested in the topic and almost annoyed at the questions he was being asked. Honestly, he looked like he couldn't get out of there fast enough, which tells me that he had an inkling that it all sounded ridiculous.
After investigating a tip from the public, we now believe the woman died at a residence in the 3900 block of First Street Northwest, and it is alleged a man who lived at that residence then decided to dispose of her remains in multiple locations, including the park in Crescent Heights. And the woman's next of kin has been notified. We don't believe that to be the case. We don't believe there to be any risk to public safety in this matter. We don't believe that the death is criminal in nature.
Secondly, photographs of the inaugural proceedings were intentionally framed in a way, in one particular tweet, to minimize the enormous support that had gathered on the National Mall.
Joshua Weise was arrested and charged for the dismemberment in June, but in early July was granted bail, much to the family's chagrin and outrage. But his bail was revoked a few weeks later when he was found to have a Leatherman-style knife in his possession. And here's the thing. They can stack charges. Like you can be charged with first-degree murder, and if the jury doesn't agree, they can acquit you of that charge, but then find you guilty of manslaughter. So they could have added manslaughter or murder to the charges and let the jury figure it out. Circumstantial cases happen all the time. There is this thing called the totality of the evidence, and in this case, even without firm physical evidence that he killed her, still the total of the evidence points to it. Or if, on the other hand, the police and prosecutors don't believe that she was murdered at all, and it was clearly an overdose, then explain it to us. Tell us how the evidence of murder isn't there, instead of just saying there is no evidence of criminality in her death. Well, then why the dismemberment? We know that even in murder-suicides that the issue doesn't formally go to court. The investigators still do an investigation and release at least some details. Inquiring minds want to know and all of that. But the media just seem to drop it as like, oh, well, this really isn't interesting as we thought it was, so we're going to move on. The two people that did show an ounce of respect to the family were Justice Mike Dinkle, who admitted that his hands were tied by the law and gave Joshua an 18-month sentence with 3 years of probation. He said what Joshua did was selfish, savage, and heinous, and that his actions prevented family members from grieving. And then the Crown prosecutor, Ken McAfee, said, the families, I'm sure, will be upset with how low the sentence is. So what makes it difficult are the limits that are placed on the judges and how the Crown prosecutors in terms of what we can ask for. Justice Mike Dinkle agreed that most charges of indignity to human remains are tied to homicides and told the family that they would not be satisfied by any sentence that he could impose. The only way I can do my job is to follow the law. It's very tragic. And Ken McAfee said the maximum penalty under the criminal code for this offense is 5 years. But the case law supports something a lot less than that. So it's very tragic, and I feel very sympathetic towards the family. It's very hard duty today. It's very hard on them. And when Joshua Weise was given an opportunity to offer an apology to the family, the 20 people in attendance all stood in solidarity and left the courtroom refusing to hear anything that he had to say. They were particularly annoyed because one of the aggravating factors against Joshua was that during his psych assessment, he revealed that he had written a comic book about his crime and was hoping to make some money off of it. Of interest to you, perhaps, is that the CBC did an investigation into murdered and missing Indigenous cases where the cause of death was suspicious but ruled to be an accident. They looked at 34 cases in Canada and found that 10 had unexplained injuries, 17 were involved in domestic and family violence, 6 were found nude or partially clothed in suspicious circumstances. In 31 of the cases, a person of interest was identified at some stage either by police or family members, but no charges were ever laid. And in 5 of the cases, the medical examiner's findings and the police findings conflicted with each other. In 25 of the 34 cases, families reported that they felt racism and assumptions about the women and their lifestyles impeded the investigations. In October of 2018, 2 years after what parts of Joey they had been able to lay to rest had been, Stephanie English organized a 200-kilometer walk, which I did the conversion for you, is 124 miles, walk from Bacani Nation to Calgary called Calling My Spirit Back to bring awareness of the issues. She says a lot of First Nations are being murdered and nothing is being said or done about it. I hope for closure, but I won't have closure. When your daughter's in the landfill, you'll never have closure. This journey I'm on is to let other people know that they're not alone. I know that I need to do this. If I can have that support throughout southern Alberta, I hope change will come. Good change. Joey's cousin Braylon, whom she was always close to, added that I often wonder what it would be like if we did not suffer the effects of intergenerational trauma, if we were brought up with the privilege and rights and respect of other ethnicities in Canada. And with that, I just want to add some parting words from Stephanie, who I find to be an amazing woman of strength and resilience. You gave birth to children. Try to bring them up in a good way. You fight tooth and nail as a parent for the betterment of your children. For me to try and have closure and peace within myself, it's tough. The thing is, I don't lose my faith because that's who I am. I'm a Blackfoot woman.